My neighbor called me at 3 in the morning. I was at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, November 2018. I had been in country for 6 weeks. My bunk was in a temporary housing unit. It smelled like diesel fuel and instant coffee. Outside the thin walls, the flight line never fully went quiet. You stopped hearing it after a while. You just learned to sleep through the noise. My phone was on a shelf above my head. I reached for it in the dark, read the number, and sat up. Paulette, Washington, 704 area code. I had known her for 11 years. She was the woman who lived 2 doors down on Whitfield Street. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, she grew tomatoes in her front yard. She knew the name of every postal worker on our block. Paulette did not make calls she wasn't certain about. If she was calling me at 3 in the morning, across 12 time zones, she had something to say. She apologized for the hour first. I told her to keep talking. She said there were people in my house. Not burglar people, not squatter people. Family people. A man. A woman. 2 young daughters. They had furniture, a mailbox key, a parking spot arrangement with the house on the left, according to Paulette, who noticed everything and forgot nothing. These people had been living in my house for at least 4 months. She had assumed I knew. Then, she had assumed less. She had asked the woman once, politely, while they were both getting the mail. The woman said they rented the house. She showed Paulette a copy of the lease agreement. It was a professional-looking document, with company letterhead. The company's name was GKM Property Solutions, LLC, registered in North Carolina. I didn't recognize that name, but I recognized the initials. Gary Keith Marsh, my mother's husband of 14 years. Before I tell you what I found when I came home, I want to know something first. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it right where you are? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. I'm Renee Holloway. I retired as a captain from the United States Army in 2021, after 20 years of service. Most of it was in military intelligence. I deployed to Afghanistan 3 times. You don't have to have deployed to understand what I'm about to tell you. You just have to have trusted someone with access to something that was yours, and assumed that the scope of what you gave was understood. I spent 2 decades learning how to identify threats, read situations, and build cases from incomplete information, in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. What I didn't know, what took me the longest to accept, even after everything that followed, is that the most operationally complex situation I would ever face wasn't in Kandahar or the Korangal Valley. It was on Whitfield Street, in a house I bought with my own money, and the threat had been inside my perimeter from the beginning. Here is what I came home to, and here is exactly what I did about it. I bought the house in 2014. That's the first thing you need to understand. Not because the house is the point of this story, though it is a point of it, but because of what that house represented, and what I gave up to get it. I was 32 years old. I had deployed twice by then. I had lived in barracks in Georgia and Texas. I shared an apartment in Clarksville, Tennessee. I rented a room above someone else's garage in Vicenza, Italy. I had accumulated almost nothing you could carry in your hands and attach meaning to. Military service teaches you that possessions are a liability. You move too often to carry much. You learn to keep things light. But saving is different from spending. Deployment pay, hazard pay, living allowances that accumulate when you have nowhere to spend money for 15 months at a time. I had been doing the arithmetic since my first tour. By the end of my second deployment, I had enough for a down payment on something real. I chose Fayetteville deliberately. Fort Bragg, Fort Liberty now. But we all still said Bragg was 15 minutes away. The community there understood military rhythms the way most places don't. Houses sat empty for a year. Families deployed and came back. Neighbors watched out for each other's property without being asked, because they had all, at some point, needed someone to do the same for them. Nobody thought it was strange. It was just the texture of life in a military town. The house was a 3-bedroom Cape Cod on a quiet street. White siding, green shutters, a backyard that was more grass than anything, but had room for a garden if I ever stayed still long enough to plant one. I furnished it in increments over 2 years of visiting on leave. A couch from a furniture store on Bragg Boulevard. A kitchen table from a woman selling her household before a PCS move. A mattress that actually fit the bed frame. By 2016, it felt like mine in a way that nowhere else I had ever lived had managed. My mother, Karen, lived 40 minutes south in a suburb outside Raleigh. She had married Gary Marsh in 2006, 2 years after my father died. Gary was a licensed real estate broker with 30 years of experience in the North Carolina residential market. He drove a clean white Cadillac, kept his shoes very polished, and knew every bank branch manager in the county by first name. At family dinners, he talked about interest rates the way some men talk about sports constantly, and with the assumption that everyone else was equally interested. I did not dislike Gary. That is important to say clearly. I didn't especially like him either, but I had no particular reason to distrust him. What I trusted, completely and without qualification, was my mother's judgment. Karen was the constant in a life built around impermanence. She drove to Fort Bragg when I came back from my first deployment and didn't ask a single question about what I'd seen over there. She answered the phone at 2 a.m. when the time zones were wrong, and I just needed to hear a familiar voice. She sent cookies to every address I gave her, across 2 decades of APO boxes, and they arrived intact more often than the odds should have allowed. When I got orders for my 3rd tour in October 2018, I called her the same evening. "I need someone to check on the house," I said. "Once a month, maybe twice. Make sure nothing's leaking. No windows broken." "Pipes haven't frozen in January." "Of course," she said. No hesitation. I mailed her 1 key on a yellow lanyard, the spare I kept on a hook by my front door, the one I'd had made at the hardware store in 2014 and never given to anyone. I did not give her a power of attorney. I did not authorize her to rent the property. I did not give her permission to enter into any arrangement, financial or otherwise, involving my home. I asked her to walk through it occasionally and make sure nothing was catastrophically wrong. That was all. That was the entire scope of what I asked. I want you to hold that detail, because the next time someone mentioned my house, I was sitting on the edge of a bunk in Bagram, in the dark, and a woman named Paulette Washington was telling me that strangers had been sleeping in my bed for 4 months. The first call I made after Paulette's was to my mother. It was 3:17 inches the morning in North Carolina. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice, when it came, was careful, not groggy, not startled, not half asleep. Just careful. It was the calibrated flatness of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation to arrive and has spent time preparing for it. "I can explain," she said, before I asked a single question. People who open with, "I can explain," have already told you everything worth knowing. The rest is just details. What followed was a conversation I have replayed too many times to count. Gary had located a family who needed short-term housing. Good people, she said. A nice family. Very clean. Very reliable. They needed somewhere for 8 or 9 months while their own house was being renovated. Gary had arranged everything. He thought it would help with my mortgage costs. He was trying to be helpful. She said helpful 3 times. "I own that house outright," I said. "There is no mortgage." A pause. Longer than it should have been. "Gary handles these things," she said. "He knows what he's doing with property." I spent the next 4 hours on the ceiling of my bunk, staring upward in the dark while the flight line did its business outside. I had 17 weeks remaining on this deployment. I was 3,000 miles from Fayetteville, and 12 time zones ahead of the East Coast. I had, as far as I could determine in that moment, exactly 2 options. Option 1, make noise immediately. Call Gary directly. involve a civilian attorney from overseas, and try to force a resolution while I was still in Afghanistan, with no ability to control how anything landed. Option 2, say nothing. Come home ready. I chose option 2. Not because I was calm, I want to be honest about that. I was not calm. I was something much colder than calm, which is an entirely different thing. I came home in March 2019. I did not stop at my mother's house. I did not call ahead. I drove directly from Pope Army Airfield to Whitfield Street. The Garcia family, I would learn their name later, had been given notice the week before. The house was empty when I arrived. Their furniture was gone. What remained was the texture of other people's lives, a faint smell of someone else's cooking, the small impression on the carpet where a child's toy box must have sat. A crayon drawing of a yellow house was left on the refrigerator door. One of the girls must have made it. I looked at it for a moment, then left it where it was. I couldn't bring myself to take it down. I photographed every room, every surface, every detail with my phone. Then, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope my mother had sent. It was the same table I'd bought secondhand from a woman doing a PCS move in 2015. I'd carried it into the house by myself. It had been here, in this same corner, waiting. The whole time strangers were sleeping in the rooms above it. She had mailed documents, as I'd asked. 3 of them. The first was the lease agreement, 18 months, $1,450 per month, payable to GKM Property Solutions, LLC, an account I had never heard of, at a bank I had no relationship with. Total rental income generated from my property, $26,100. Not a dollar of it was in any account connected to me. I set that aside and picked up the second document. It was a recorded deed of trust filed with Cumberland County, North Carolina, a home equity line of credit, against my house, for $95,000. My signature appeared on page 4. I need to stop here and be specific about something. I have a particular signature. 20 years of signing military documents in triplicate teaches you a very specific relationship with your own name on paper. I know the curve of my capital R. I know the way my double L connects. I know how my hand moves when I write Holloway under official conditions versus casually, and I know the difference. What was on page 4 was not my signature. It was a close attempt. It was good enough to pass a routine bank review, but it was not mine. I read the document twice. I read it a third time. I photographed every page, each one flat on the kitchen table in the afternoon light. Then, I closed the folder and set it next to my coffee cup. I sat very still. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in a slow diagonal, and I didn't move with it. At some point, I realized my hands were pressed flat on the table the way you press them down when you need something solid beneath you. I looked at my hands, then at the document, then at the window, where the backyard sat in the late sun, exactly as I had left it 18 months ago. Same grass, same fence line, everything was in its place, except the fact of what was on the table in front of me. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the coffee to go cold, long enough for the light to change twice. Then, I picked up my phone. Gary Marsh, my mother's husband. The man with the polished shoes, the 30-year license, and all those bank manager friendships had applied for and received a $95,000 home equity loan against a property he had no legal authority to encumber. He used a forged power of attorney document and a signature that was not mine. Let me give you the number one more time, clearly, before we move on. $95,000, borrowed against a house I owned debt-free, in my name, without my knowledge. While I was serving in Afghanistan, I didn't call Gary that night. I called Dennis Park. Dennis had been a JAG officer at Fort Bragg for 11 years before transitioning to civilian practice. He was the kind of attorney who had seen enough military property fraud cases to not be surprised by anything, but was careful to make you feel he was. I told him I needed an in-person consultation as soon as possible, that I had documents, and that I thought the situation was serious. "How serious?" he said. "Forgery," I said. "HELOC fraud. Possibly wire fraud. I don't want to miss anything." He told me to come in at 7:30 the next morning. I arrived with 2 folders and a phone containing 47 photographs. Dennis reviewed everything without saying a word for 20 minutes. When he finished, he put his glasses on the desk and looked at me directly. "Captain Holloway," he said, "this is a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes." He walked me through the structure methodically. A fraudulent POA, the notarization stamp on the document, appeared valid, but the originating attorney had no record of ever executing it. This meant the stamp had been either duplicated or stolen. A HELOC application was built on that document, processed through standard bank channels that rarely scrutinize POA credentials closely when everything else looks professional. Gary had known exactly which parts of the system moved too fast for careful review. Someone who didn't understand real estate transactions in depth couldn't have done this, Dennis said. He knew which seams to push. "Who do I report this to?" He counted on 3 fingers. FBI field office in Raleigh for the federal mortgage fraud. NC Real Estate Commission for his broker license. And I want every document you have, because we're going to file civil action for damages on top of everything else. I asked how long it would take. Dennis looked at me steadily. "These things take time." "Renee." "Good." I said. I meant it. I did not want this to move fast. Fast means mistakes. Fast means gaps. I had spent 14 months in military intelligence, learning that the difference between an operation that succeeds and one that collapses is the patience to build the target package completely before you act. I went home and opened a new folder. I labeled it with the date and nothing else. And I began. Meanwhile, and I learned this through channels I won't fully detail. Because the people who told me didn't need to be named my mother had decided that the best defense was a narrative. The story circulating through her church community and her neighborhood social circle had a consistent and deliberate shape. Renee had been struggling since her last deployment. PTSD. Difficulty with finances. Difficulty with relationships. Emotional instability. Gary had intervened in the management of her property out of genuine concern, trying to help a woman who was clearly not well enough to handle her own affairs. The situation was very sad. Gary was just doing what family does. When I heard about it, and I heard about it through 2 separate people within the same week, I did not call my mother. I did not call Gary. I documented that I had heard it. I added the documentation to the folder. And I continued working, because I understood immediately what that narrative was designed to do. If I filed a complaint, Gary's defense team would argue that I had provided verbal authorization during a period of diminished mental capacity, and here was my own mother, ready to testify about my condition. It was a preemptive strike. It was constructed before I had made a single official move, and it was elegant, in the most precise and disgusting sense of that word. I heard the story. I did not react to it. I added it to the folder and kept going. I found out later through Dennis, who came across it while cross-referencing Gary's professional activity records, that the evening before I filed the federal complaint, Gary was at the North Carolina Association of Realtors annual recognition dinner in Raleigh. He received a Peer Appreciation Award. The citation mentioned his 30 years of dedicated service to the North Carolina real estate community. There was a photograph on the association's website. Gary was at a podium, holding a plaque, shaking hands with the chapter president. His shoes were polished. He was smiling. I was at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock that same night, cross-referencing financial tracing documents against 4 sets of Cumberland County deed records. The table had been my primary workspace for 9 months. I knew the position of every folder on it without looking. Dennis sent me the photograph as an attachment the following morning. No message, just the image. I printed it and added it to the folder. Not for any legal reason. The folder was already complete. I added it because I wanted the full picture. Every piece of it. Miguel Garcia called me in April, 6 weeks after I came home. He had gotten my number through Paulette Washington, who had gotten it through a chain I could never fully reconstruct. He apologized before I said hello. He said he and his wife Rosa hadn't known needed me to understand that first, before anything else. They had found the rental through a legitimate-looking platform listing. The lease was professional. GKM Property Solutions had a functional website, a listed phone number, a documented LLC. Gary had met them in person, shook their hands, and showed them around the house himself. We met at a diner off Bragg Boulevard on a Tuesday. Miguel was 41, precise and economical with his words. He was the kind of man who chooses what he says the same way he chooses what he spends, nothing wasted. He brought a folder. He put an envelope on the table between us. 18 months of rent receipts. Every payment documented. Organized chronologically. He had kept them because he kept everything. "These are yours," he said. I looked at the receipts. Then I looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that means a person is choosing which true thing to say, rather than deciding whether to tell the truth. Finally, he spoke. "My brother did 2 tours in Iraq. He stopped, then started again. I would have wanted someone to do this for him. I'm going to move through that moment quickly, because it is not the kind of thing I can describe at length while staying composed. What I will tell you is that it changed something in my understanding of the story I was inside. What Miguel told me next changed the shape of the case entirely. He had tried, at one point during their tenancy, to reach GKM Property Solutions about a slow-leaking faucet. He'd left multiple messages over 3 weeks with no response. While searching for an alternate contact, he'd found a discussion thread on an online forum for North Carolina landlords and rental property owners. Gary's name appeared not as GKM, but under his own name and broker license number. The posts were careful, legal careful, the way people write when they want to say something true without being sued for saying it. But the pattern was readable. 2 other threads, 2 other addresses in Cumberland County, 2 other situations involving military families and unauthorized rental activity. Complaints had been filed and somehow quietly resolved. I photographed the forum pages. I went back to Dennis that afternoon. We cross-referenced Gary's license number against the NC Real Estate Commission complaint database. There were 3 prior inquiries attached to his record. 2 had been administratively closed. 1 was technically still open, filed by a sergeant named Alicia Torres in 2017. She had deployed to South Korea. Her house on Yadkin Road had been rented without her authorization. The fraudulent POA on her file used the same notary stamp as the document I had. Same stamp. Different properties, different years, different victims. Dennis set the comparison side by side on his desk. "He's been running this for years," he said. He mentioned something else, almost in passing, near the end of that meeting, when investigators later searched Gary's home office as part of the federal process. They found a filing cabinet in the back of his closet. Inside was a row of labeled envelopes, one for each property he had managed through GKM. Each envelope contained a key. Dennis described them without particular emphasis. He was already moving on to the next document. I stopped him. "What kind of keys?" He checked his notes. "Various. One was on a yellow lanyard." I didn't say anything. Dennis moved on. I thought about that cabinet for a long time afterward. The envelopes, the labeled rows, the yellow lanyard hanging in the dark of someone else's closet. In a filing system that Gary had apparently maintained for years, it was the most organized thing he ever did. I thought about my mother, about when she must have found out about Sergeant Torres, about the arithmetic she must have done, about the conclusion she must have reached that what Gary was capable of was manageable, or explainable, or not her problem to resolve, about the fact that she had still put my key in his hands. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it is the hardest part of this story to write, and I won't pretend otherwise. Gary Marsh committed crimes. Those crimes have clear definitions, clear precedents, and a clear legal resolution. Gary is comprehensible. Karen is not. My mother did not forge documents. My mother did not fraudulently obtain a HELOC. My mother did not collect $1 of rental income from my house. What my mother did was know at some point, with enough specificity to matter what Gary was capable of, and she gave him the key anyway. She may have told herself it would be different this time. She may have told herself I wouldn't find out, or that it was temporary, or that the money wasn't really hurting anyone. People who love someone dishonest perform this kind of arithmetic constantly, refining the formula that lets them hold both things at once. But she knew, and she gave him the key. I called Patricia Walsh the next morning. Patricia had spent 15 years as a forensic accountant on financial crime cases. She had once told me, at a veterans networking event, that mortgage fraud was the cockroach of white-collar crime. You find one, you're already years too late. I told her I had a case and needed full financial tracing. Patricia found the full picture within 9 days. 4 military families, 4 deployment windows, 4 forged power of attorney documents with variations of the same fraudulent notary stamp, 4 unauthorized HELOCs totaling $312,000. Approximately $218,000 flowed through accounts Patricia could partially trace to Gary's personal investments, and the operating costs of 2 separate LLCs he had opened and closed. Rental income from the 4 properties combined, an estimated $74,000. None of it reported to the property owners. Gary Marsh had been doing this, in documented form, for at least 9 years. Possibly longer. He was still licensed, still operating, still accepting new clients, still, as far as I could tell, attending real estate association mixers and collecting referrals from people who had known him for decades. I added Patricia's analysis to the folder. The folder was now substantial 9 months of evidence, organized chronologically, cross-referenced, complete. I had started it with a date and no title. I still hadn't given it one. It didn't need one. I contacted the FBI field office in Raleigh. I sent everything I had to the NC Real Estate Commission's investigative division. I filed the civil suit through Dennis. I reached out, carefully, to the attorneys representing Sergeant Torres and 2 of the other 3 families we had identified. And then I waited, because the only thing left to do was wait for the system to move at the speed the system moves. Gary, as far as I could determine, had no idea any of this was happening. The NC Real Estate Commission hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in October 2020. Revocation hearings are public proceedings. Gary's attorney had filed 2 motions to move it to closed session, citing privacy concerns and the complexity of the financial evidence. Both motions were denied by the commission chair, a woman named Helen Briggs. She had been practicing real estate law for 27 years, and her reputation was that she was extremely fair and absolutely unmovable. I want to tell you about the room. The commission's hearing space in Raleigh is a plain, formal room, government-issue chairs, fluorescent lighting with one panel that buzzed slightly, a raised panel at the front where the 5 commissioners sat, a gallery of rows behind a low wooden rail. When I arrived at 8:45 a.m., there were already people in the gallery. I want to be specific about who they were. Some were commission staff and legal counsel. Some were reporters from the real estate trade press. Some were attorneys for the other families. Some were people Gary had worked with, referred clients to, and shared professional association dinners with over 3 decades. Men and women who had put his name in their church bulletins when congregants needed help selling a house. People who had trusted him with referrals. The same way you trust something that has never, as far as you know, broken. He had not told any of them why they were there. Gary arrived in a gray suit. His shoes were polished to the standard I had come to think of as his signature. He looked like a man who had been through regulatory processes before and understood them to be manageable. His attorney, a competent man from a Raleigh firm that handled professional license disputes, walked beside him with the measured confidence of someone who has prepared a defense they believe in. I sat in the 3rd row. Dennis was on my left. Patricia Walsh was on my right. I had said nothing publicly about this case for 14 months. No social media, No conversations outside the necessary legal ones. I had built the targeting package, and I had waited. The commission's lead investigator presented the case over 2 hours and 11 minutes. Every document, every forged signature, every LLC transaction, the complete timeline of 4 properties, 4 military families, 4 unauthorized encumbrances, and the flow of $312,000 through a financial structure built specifically to survive surface-level scrutiny. Patricia's forensic analysis appeared in graphics clear and simple enough that everyone in that room could follow exactly where the money had gone. The room became notably quieter somewhere around the 3rd property. When the investigator reached my case, specifically my forged POA, my property, my $95,000 HELOC, he displayed a side-by-side comparison on the screen at the front of the room. My actual signature from my military personnel file, digitally isolated and enlarged. The forged signature from the POA document, similarly enlarged. 40 people saw that comparison simultaneously. Gary did not look at the screen. He looked at the table in front of him and straightened his tie with 2 fingers. He straightened it again 30 seconds later. His attorney presented the defense. It was built on 2 arguments. First, that Gary had acted in good faith based on verbal authorizations he believed were legally sufficient. Second, that the POA documents had been provided to him by third parties he could not now identify. The attorney used the phrase clerical confusion 4 times in his opening statement. He suggested that military deployment schedules created inherent communication gaps, making misunderstandings of this nature understandable, if regrettable. Commissioner Briggs asked Gary directly whether he had ever received written authorization from Renee Holloway to manage her property or apply for credit against it. Gary said he believed there had been a verbal agreement. She asked whether he had sought to confirm that verbal agreement in writing before submitting a HELOC application. Gary said he had relied on standard industry practice. Commissioner Briggs looked at him over her glasses for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "standard industry practice does not include a fraudulent notary stamp." The room did not react dramatically. Formal proceedings rarely produce the reactions people imagine. But there is a specific quality to a room when 30 people simultaneously reach the same conclusion about a person, and that quality is unmistakable. 43 minutes later, the commission voted. Gary Keith Marsh's real estate broker license issued 1,995. Renewed every 2 years for 29 consecutive years, was revoked effective immediately. A formal referral to the North Carolina Attorney General's Office for criminal prosecution was entered into the record. The FBI filed charges 11 days later. Mortgage fraud, wire fraud, 2 counts of identity fraud, federal charges, with federal exposure. The investigators came to Gary's house on a Wednesday morning. His Cadillac was in the driveway. I know this because a neighbor called my mother to tell her. My mother called me 40 minutes later. She sounded different than she had in any conversation we'd had since I came home from Afghanistan. Not careful, not scripted. Not the practiced flatness of the woman who had answered the phone at 3:17 a.m. with, "I can explain." She sounded older, as though something that had been holding her upright had quietly been removed. "He's being arrested," she said. "I know," I said. "Renee, Mom." She went quiet. I had thought about this conversation for months. I had written versions of it at the kitchen table, late at night, in the same notebook where I'd started tracking dates and names 14 months earlier. The versions I crossed out were longer. Some of them were very long. They explained things carefully. They inventoried the damage with precision, what I had needed from her. What she had understood about Gary's history. What she had chosen, regardless. They were complete. They were accurate. I didn't use any of them. What I said was this: "The key I gave you was to check on the house. That was all I asked. That was all it was." She didn't answer. "I don't need you to explain it," I said. "I understand what happened. The file is closed. The line stayed open for a few more seconds. The kind of silence that isn't waiting for anything, just ending. Then I said goodbye, and I ended the call. I'm not going to tell you that sentence made anything easier. Closing a file and resolving what's inside it are not the same thing, and I know that better than most. But I had spent 14 months building a case that was complete in every factual detail, and I had learned something during that process. A case that is complete doesn't require the other party's acknowledgement to stand. It stands on its own. What Karen chose, and why she chose it, is a question she will carry. That is not my file to manage. As for Gary, the criminal case resolved in 2022. He entered a guilty plea to 2 federal counts, 14 months in a federal correctional facility. Full restitution ordered across all 4 affected families. Here is my number, specifically. The HELOC was $95,000. The rental income collected from my property was $26,100. That is $121,100, extracted from a house I bought with 11 years of deployment savings, a house I had never borrowed against, never encumbered with a single additional dollar of obligation. The restitution order in my case was $131,400, principal, plus documented interest, plus a portion of my legal costs. 6 months after Gary's license was revoked, the NC Real Estate Commission published updated guidance on power of attorney verification for transactions involving military deployment. The new protocol requires independent notary confirmation and a direct contact attempt to the service member through official military channels, not family intermediaries, before any POA can be used to encumber residential property. It went into effect January 2022. Dennis sent me the bulletin as a PDF attachment. No message, just the document. I read it twice. Then, I opened the folder one last time, filed the bulletin at the back behind everything else, and closed it. I put it on the shelf in my office where it has been ever since. I haven't needed to open it again. I don't know exactly how many households that protocol will protect going forward. I don't need to know. It's enough that it exists. And that it exists in part because 4 families built a case complete enough that the commission had no reasonable alternative but to act on it. Gary Marsh spent 30 years knowing how the system worked. He was right about that. What he didn't account for was a military intelligence officer with 14 months, a forensic accountant, a former JAG attorney, and the particular kind of patience that comes from learning over 2 decades in environments where impatience has permanent consequences, that an incomplete operation is more dangerous than no operation at all. He built his method on the assumption that the people he targeted were too busy, too far away, or too worn down to come home and look closely at the paperwork. For 9 years. He was right. He was not right about me. 3 weeks after the commission hearing, I went to the hardware store on Bragg Boulevard and bought 2 gallons of paint. Sage green. I had chosen the color years before I ever had time to use it, the specific shade I always meant to put on the living room walls and never stayed in one place long enough to get around to. I bought new rollers, new brushes, a roll of painter's tape. I came home and moved the furniture myself, the couch to the center of the room, the bookshelf away from the far wall, the end tables stacked in the hallway. I taped the baseboards and the trim. I cut in along the ceiling by hand. Before I started painting, I called a locksmith. I had changed the locks once when I first came home from Afghanistan, a practical decision, since Gary had held my only spare for 18 months, and I had no way of knowing what copies existed. But I had been meaning to do a full rekey ever since, and I had kept putting it off. The locksmith arrived in the early afternoon. He needed all existing keys to calibrate the new cylinders. I gave him the one on my regular ring. I didn't have a spare to give him. The one on the yellow lanyard. The one I'd mailed to my mother in October 2018 with instructions to check on the house once a month had been in Gary's filing cabinet. It had been logged as evidence. It was not coming back. The locksmith asked if I wanted a spare made with the new key. I told him yes. 1 spare, plain metal ring. He finished in 40 minutes. I walked through every door when he was done, everything locked and unlocked the way it was supposed to. I put the new spare in a kitchen drawer, in a spot I chose deliberately, and left it there. I was taping the baseboards near the kitchen doorway when I noticed the crayon drawing was still on the refrigerator. The Garcia girls had been gone for 3 weeks. I had walked past it every day and hadn't touched it. I stopped taping, crossed the kitchen, and looked at it up close for the first time. Yellow house, blue sky. 2 figures in the yard that might have been people or might have been trees, the way children draw when the image is clear in their mind and the hand is still learning to follow. I took it down carefully, folded it once along the middle, and put it in the kitchen drawer next to the new spare key. I don't know what I'll do with it eventually. For now it stays. It seems wrong to throw away something a child made. I painted that room alone. Over 6 hours, with no music on. I want to tell you why that mattered. During the 18 months, the Garcia family had lived in my house. They had painted that wall a warm, pale yellow. It was a good color. They had taste. But under their yellow were 2 coats of the original builder's white I had always intended to replace. And under everything was the wall itself, which had been a stranger's wall. And then my wall. And then a rented wall. And then, after 14 months, a federal case, a revocation hearing, and a phone call I have thought about many times since mine again. When I painted sage green over all of it, I wasn't covering their yellow. I was starting from what I had intended, instead of from what had accumulated on top of it. There is a difference. It meant something to me. Paulette Washington knocked on my door at 5:30 that evening with a casserole. I still had paint on my forearms. She looked past me at the wall and said, "That's a good color." I told her I thought so too. She sat at my kitchen table while I washed up. That table had held 14 months of folders. Documents, photographs, printed forum pages, and 1 photo of a man at a podium. Now it held a casserole dish and 2 coffee cups. The difference between those 2 versions of the same table was everything that had happened in between. We talked about her garden, the road construction project that had been irritating the entire street, and whether the Thai restaurant on Person Street was as good as the reviews suggested. Nothing about the case. Nothing about Gary. Nothing about my mother. Just ordinary things. Which are the best kind of things when you have spent 14 months living almost entirely inside an extraordinary situation. Before she left, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a greeting card, the generic drugstore kind, pre-printed with a congratulations message inside that she had crossed out completely. In her careful cursive, she had written 2 words, "Still standing." I put it on the counter next to the coffee maker. It's still there. You didn't have to have served in the army to lose something the way I almost lost this house. You just had to have given someone access to your accounts, your property, your signature, your trust, and assumed the scope of what you gave was understood. Most people have done that. Most people have never checked. Military intelligence teaches you that verification and trust are not opposites. You can trust someone completely and still verify what they're doing with what you've given them. Not because you suspect them. Because the paperwork is the only thing in the room that doesn't change its story, depending on who's telling it. The most expensive assumption I made wasn't that Gary Marsh was trustworthy. It was that access was the same as authorization. It isn't. It never is. Check your accounts. Know your documents. Understand what you've authorized in writing versus what you've only said out loud. The gap between those 2 things is where people like Gary Marsh do their work quietly, patiently, and for a very long time. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. You only need 1 word to answer it. Right now, is there someone who has access to something important of yours, and you haven't verified it in more than a year? Yes or no? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this one matter to you, the subscribe button is right there. I'll keep making them. Take care of yourselves. And take care of your paperwork.